Hi everyone, and welcome back. This section is going to introduce and explain one of Excel's most important and helpful data analysis tools, and this is the pivot table. Pivot tables are an interactive way of quickly and easily summarizing large amounts of data, and they're excellent for drilling down and exploring your data in different ways. To illustrate how to use pivot tables, we'll use our IMDb movies dataset that we used in section 5. Once again, to follow along with me here, you can find this dataset in the course materials folder for this section or within the datasets folder. As we're already familiar with this dataset, I won't bother introducing the different columns, we'll just jump straight in. So, due to the sheer volume of information and different columns in this dataset, it can be hard to draw any meaningful or helpful conclusions about the trends or patterns in our data. For instance, when looking at our first movie in the dataset, which is The Shining, we don't know really whether the score, budget, or the gross revenue for this film are representative and average within the dataset, or whether they're higher or lower than most of the other values. Pivot tables allow us to very quickly and easily summarize and view this data from different perspectives, allowing us to quickly pick out trends and patterns in our data that would otherwise be hard to see. Quite often, pivot tables have a reputation for being difficult and hard to learn, but they're actually very straightforward and mostly drag and drop. So let's say that we want to answer a couple of different questions. First, we'll explore how the IMDb rating, which in this dataset is called the scores, that's in column F, has changed across the films for different years. So have films got better or worse over the years? Next, we'll have a look at how the gross revenue of films changes by the genre. So which genres tend to be the most successful at the box office in terms of revenue. Before creating our pivot table, we'll first need to make sure that our data is prepared and in the correct format. The first thing to ensure is that our data is in a tabular format. So here we have our column headings at the top and then the associated data underneath. It's also better if our column headings are descriptive and relevant to the data that they're describing, as these column headings will be used by the pivot table. Two other things that we should check are that our data is all together, with no empty columns or empty rows present, as this will affect how the pivot table is created. And then finally, an optional step that we could take is to format our data as a table, and this will make it much easier to turn it into a pivot table. To format our data as a table, we can go to our Home tab and then select Format as Table. And just make sure that when you click this, you've got any cell from within your dataset selected. We then just have to select the format of our table, and I usually go for the first one here, which is just grey. Alternatively, we could have used the shortcut, which is just Ctrl+T, and that's the option that I tend to use as I find it much quicker. And next, our table does have headers, so I'll keep this option selected and hit OK. Again, this step is optional, and it's not needed to format your data as a table, but it does make the process of creating a pivot table easier, as we can just select the table for our data range. With all these steps done, we're now ready to create our pivot table. Let's go over to the Insert tab, and our first button here on the left is the Pivot Table button. As we formatted our dataset as a table, Excel has automatically been able to select our entire data range here, which you can see in our table/range input box. We didn't rename our table, so it's just left as the default of table 1. The next thing we need to specify is our output location. So we can either specify to place it in a new worksheet or within an existing worksheet. I usually prefer to put it into a new worksheet, and this way it's easier to see and work with without any distractions from our other data. So I'll leave it as it is and click OK. And this now puts it into a new worksheet, which as we can see down here is called Sheet 1. Off to the right of our screen, you'll notice we get a new pane called the Pivot Table Fields, and we can use this pane to create and specify data for our pivot table. At the top, we can find a list of all the different columns that we had in our dataset. So our movie name, the rating, genre, the year it was released, and so on. Below this, we have 4 different areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. And this is where we get to specify what data we have in our pivot table, as well as how it's arranged. So we could choose to put our data into rows or into columns, what values to use, and then finally, what filters, if any, we want to apply. As mentioned earlier, for our first question, let's say that we're interested in looking at how the average score for films has changed over the years. To answer this, we'll need two different columns, the year column and the score column. Let's go up to our year column and then drag this down into our rows. As soon as we do this, we can see that our pivot table on the left updates, and now we have a list of all the different years going down in rows. Next, we'll need to provide what data we want to look at, and this will be the score for our films. If we click on our score column and then drag this down into our values area, then we can see that in our pivot table, we have a new column for the sum of the score. So currently, this is adding up all the different scores films released in the associated year. But for our case, that's not what we want. Instead of this sum, we want to calculate the average for each of our years instead. So what we can do is right click on our sum of score column and then go down to where it says summarize values by, and here we can see that it's currently set to sum. But there's quite a few other different options here, like count, average, max, min, product, and distinct count. We want the average, so I'll just go ahead and select average. And now our column has updated to show the average values for each of our years, as opposed to the sum. We could also have changed this by changing our value field settings down here in our values area. And also, while we're in this menu, I'll change the number format so that only one decimal point is shown, and that way it looks a little nicer. Looking down our list, we can see that the average rating of films looks to have remained fairly consistent since 1980, but we can see a slight increase around 2010. To demonstrate the flexibility and power of pivot tables, we'll now break our average rating down further by the genre of the film as well. If we drag our genre column into the columns area, that will then add in columns for each of our genres. And now we're able to see the average rating for each year, but also broken down by the genre of the film as well. Ordinarily, to create all these functions would be quite a time-consuming process and also be prone to errors along the way. But with a pivot table, all we have to do is drag and drop the columns as needed. For instance, we could remove the genres from our columns by dragging it out of the area, and then in its place, we'll put in the rating. And just as quick as that, we've now completely changed our entire pivot table to look at our data from a completely different perspective. Let's now move on to look at a different example. So we'll look at how the average gross revenue varies by genre. So basically, we want to see which genres tend to have the most box office success in terms of gross revenue. Let's start by removing all the data that we have in our pivot tables currently by dragging and dropping them out of their respective areas. So I'll remove the rating from our columns, the year from our rows, and then the score from our values. And now we can drag the genre into our rows, and then this time we'll drag in the gross column into our values. Again, we'll have to change this to the average, and then also we'll format the number as a currency. Now that we have our results, let's find out which genre has the highest average gross revenue. Instead of manually searching through these values and comparing them until we find the highest, we can instead use the sort functionality to do this for us. We'll right click on our column and go to sort, and then within here, we can select the largest to smallest option. And Excel will sort our values in descending order, making it easy for us to see that animation films have the highest average gross revenue. And if we double click on this cell, we'll get a new worksheet which contains the data that is associated to this value. So here we can see all the animation films in our dataset that are contributing to the average gross value that we saw before. To go back to our pivot table, we can either select the pivot table worksheet from our sheet selection or hit undo, and that will also remove the entire sheet. Let's instead now have a look at the sum of the gross revenue column. So we'll change how our values are shown to the sum, and we can see here now which genre has made the highest amount in total. And looking at this, the action genre is by far the highest grossing genre with over 243 billion in gross revenue, compared to comedy in second place with a total gross revenue of just over 97 billion. Currently, we can see the total values of the sum of our gross revenue, but instead, it may be helpful to see what this is as a percent of our grand total for the entire dataset. And we can see what this is down here at the bottom of our pivot table in row 23. so just a little over 587 billion. So I think it would be helpful to see both the total values as well as the percent. So I'll go ahead and create a new column for our percentage value. We can drag our gross column into our values area again. So now we have two columns showing the same data, but just the second without the currency formatting. Let's right click on our second sum of gross column, and this time we'll go to the show values as menu. And we've got quite a few different options here, but we're interested in the percent of grand total option. So let's select that. And now we can see the percentage contribution of each genre to our total gross revenue for the entire dataset. Okay, and this is it for the basics and introduction to pivot tables. In the next lecture, we'll have a quick look at how to format our pivot tables, so changing what data the pivot table presents, and also the overall visual styling of our pivot table too. So I'll see you all in the next lecture.